So the heart of the gospel is God's heart and his motive of why he gave his son's life for you. The title of this series, which is appropriate for this time of year, is First Things First. It's a time to go back and look at what God's order is. And some of you may not know what it is in certain areas. We're going to look at it in different areas of our life. Because to begin this year, I really sense, and for what God wants to do, is he wants us to get things in order. He wants us to get things in order. We're going to see this morning, and that's the title of today, God is a God of order. So let's start out by looking in Titus chapter 1. By the way, if you ever had to go, and we hope you didn't, but if you ever had to go into an emergency room, what you find is they follow a particular order. It's called triage. They go through a list of things to check out in you, and the first thing they don't do is they don't check, whether or not you have acne. They don't check whether or not, you're having a little trouble hearing. They check what? They check your vital signs. Vital means what's necessary to live. They check your vital functions first because the first thing they want to make sure of is that those vital organs are operating properly. So they have an order by which they examine you and an order by which they'll treat you, and that order is in order of importance for what's necessary for your living, for your survival, and then eventually for your enjoyment of life. I just had my annual physical, and I go through this, they sit you down, take everything off, put the Johnny on, it's of course cold in the back, and then the nurse comes in and she takes your pulse, she takes your temperature, and she takes your blood pressure, and I'm feeling fine. But her assignment is to start with the vital signs and make sure. So there's an order in which things are done, and it's an order of importance. In Titus, the Apostle Paul is writing this letter to one of his sons in the faith because he's sending them to a place called Crete, the island of Crete, and we don't have time to get into it, but it was a place where all kinds of strange things were going on. And we're going to just look at verse 5. For this reason, Paul's writing this is why I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. And then he's going to go on down and talk about the order within the church, order within the family. So the Apostle Paul is saying, I've left you in Crete, and I left you for a reason. Because I want you to set in the church in order. Now, if he's leaving Titus there to set the church in order, that must tell us that the church was out of order. You ever go into a restroom or something and you'll see a sign or on a water fountain, out of order? That just means it's not working. But things can be working and still be out of order. You can still be breathing and your heart beating, but your blood pressure is going through the sky and you've got a temperature of 102. They're signs that something is wrong. So when you go to the doctor and they take your temperature, they don't treat the temperature. The temperature is a sign that something's wrong. And so they want to find out what's wrong, what's out of order in your body, because everything's functioning in the correct order, that you will be operating in good health. And so there's a spiritual health for a church, there's a spiritual health for a family, there's a spiritual health for a marriage, there's a spiritual health for your finances, there's a spiritual health for your own spiritual life. And Paul is saying to Titus, I've left you there because things are not in order, and I've left you there to set them in order and to set in the church elders. And then he talks about what the requirements are for an elder. So what we see here is God cares about the order in the church. Now, there are some churches that are so orderly that God can't do what he wants to do. But there are some churches that are so led by the Spirit that there is no order there, and God still can't do what he wants to do. Order is let me give you a definition of order. This is the Oxford Dictionary's definition. It's the arrangement, which is putting things in a particular sequence, or the disposition of people or things in relation to each other, this is what I want you to see, according to a particular sequence, pattern, or method. It's really simple. When you went to school, you learned an order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's an order. That's an order for numbers. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. It's an order to the letters. God is a God of order. If there's no order in the universe, there'd be no basis for science. It depends on structure and laws that can be relied upon. When I was growing up, I did not do well in math, and therefore I did not like math. Those tend to go together. When I was in college, you had to take a math class. And they had this course that was in the course listing called the New Math. Well, I saw that as kind of a fresh start. So I signed up for that one. And actually, I did very well in that one because I had a whole different attitude towards it. It was like a new start to it. And I don't remember really anything that was in it other than it was a new approach to math. But I remember thinking of this even back then. That's interesting. They've got a new concept of math, but I'll bet you when the teacher wants his salary calculated, he uses the old method. Because I want something that's reliable. So that if I'm paid at a certain rate and I put 40 hours in, I want 40 times my rate, and I want to know what that is every week or every month or whenever it comes out. Why? Because math is truth. I tried 2 + 2 is 5. It didn't work. The teacher didn't accept it. Well, I was just being creative, you know. They didn't see it that way. They just thought it was wrong. And it was. So there's an order to the universe. There's an order to mathematics. There's an order to everything. And some of us are more orderly in our thinking than others. But we learned in Wednesday nights when we were talking about renewing the mind, that all of our minds think in patterns. Some of your patterns are very rational and logical, and some of them seem illogical and irrational, but there's a pattern to them. Our mind has an innate, built-in tendency to try to draw meaning out of things, to connect things together and form some kind of meaning or lesson out of things. Or what does this mean? This is why when some catastrophe happens, people try to figure, well, why is this happening? How come this is happening? They're trying to find meaning out of it because our mind is made to work that way because we're made in the image of God. God is a God of order. He creates things in order. Let's go to, there's an order in heaven. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We learned in School of Ministry, School of Ministry course we did on Wednesday night in Renewing the Mind, that the Father is first. Everything comes from Him. Jesus is second. Jesus said when a man came to Him and says, "Good Master," He said, No. There's only one who's good, innately good, and that's my Father. Hebrews 1:3 says, He is the outshining of the Father's glory. He is the outshining, not the reflection, the outshining of His Father's glory. So He's second. And then the Holy Spirit is third. They're all God, but there's a priority within God. Actually, Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15 says at the end, He's going to turn and hand all authority back to the Father when all of this wraps up. When He's finished what He was assigned to do, He's going to turn it all back into the Father's hands. So Jesus came to serve the Father because the Father was the one, our Father who is in heaven. But the Holy Spirit serves Jesus. He says He didn't come to speak on His own, but He speaks whatever He hears, which is what Jesus speaks. He comes to reflect Christ to us and make His presence in us. So in God Himself, there's an order and a priority. And then once you get outside of God, in heaven, there's a priority. There are angels, but then there are archangels. They have a higher position, a higher authority. We don't know much about them except Gabriel refers to himself as an archangel. Ark in Greek means above, higher. Lucifer most likely was an archangel, but what Lucifer did is he did not accept the order, the heavenly order, and he tried to usurp that order. And he got out of order. Let's go to Genesis chapter 1. Good place to start the year. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God. Yeah, I know. That's a profound statement. In the beginning, God. We could probably teach that for a whole year. I'm not going to, at least directly. In the beginning, God. In other words, before anything was, God. So we're talking about priorities. We're talking about order. And so before anything else was, there was God. And God created the heavens and the earth. God created the heavens and the earth. They didn't create themselves and discover God. God created them, and then we've been in the process of discovering God. And this is the issue, and I don't really going to get off on this morning. This is the issue that scientists can't deal with. They can piece things together, track things together, go back and evolve things from one another, but at some point, there has to be a beginning. What did it evolve out of? Something can't evolve out of nothing because that's the antithesis of evolving. One of the leading proponents today of evolution and of God doesn't exist, when he was pressed on this issue, he said, well, the best theory we've come up with is that some aliens came here and deposited the very first... It takes infinitely more faith to believe that than to believe there's a God who created. So you have to be intentionally blind. Intentionally blind. You have to choose to not look at the creation. You have to choose to not look at the reality that's around you. And if you have that prejudice ahead of time, you won't see him. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Created everything. Verse 2. And the earth was without form and void. I don't want to spend the time to go into this, but there's a theory, and it's just a theory because we can't prove it one way or the other, that there's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2. Because the word form here in Hebrew, the word form in Hebrew is bohu, not buhu, but bohu, B-O-H-U, which means an emptiness that's lacking order, a lack of order. And the word void is the word tohu, which means chaos. Chaos. So there's a theory that God created everything and then it was destroyed, and then God came in a second time to recreate everything and take this chaos and bring order out of it. Whether that's what happened or not, I don't know, and I won't know till I get to heaven, and it's probably not going to be in the top list of my questions to ask God. But what this does say is there was a time when this creation was without order, when it was chaos. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over its waters. And then starting in verse 3, God begins to bring order out of the chaos. God says, let there be light. God says, separate the light from the darkness. God says, let there be water. Separate the water from the land. God begins to create boundaries and order and separation. God begins to take this chaos and form order out of it. And then in Genesis chapter 1, the last thing God creates is man. So in the order of creation, time-wise, God creates man last. And I believe the reason, and it's just my belief, that the reason God created man last is he was creating this universe for man. Man is unique in all of this creation. Because in everything else God created, God just said, let there be. But when it comes to man, he says he formed him. He formed him out of the dust of the earth. That's his body. And he breathed into him out of his own lungs, whether they're lungs like ours or not. They breathed out of his own being the breath of life. And that word breath in Hebrew means literally the animal life of God, the living, what you consider life and I consider life. Breathed it into him. I believe the image I have is God took this pile of dirt and held him up like this and went, and he became a living being. Man is the only being God created that it says he made him in his image. And then when he finished this creation, the last verse says, he said, he looked at all of this creation and said, it's very good. Now, chapter 2 is also a story of creation, but it seems to be in a different order because he starts out with man. Chapter 2, I believe, is the story of creation in terms of order of importance. 1 is the order of time, 2 is the order of importance. But what we want to look at here this morning is there's an order to it. There's an order to it. There's an order to it. God creates things, and when he creates things, he creates them with an order and in an order. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Let's go down to verse 40. Let all things be done decently and in order. There's a verse back in 31, we're going to turn back there, but where in terms of this, because he's talking about this flowing of the Spirit, and he says the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. In other words, when somebody begins to flow in the Spirit, they don't get out of control. One of the signs it's not God is when they're out of control. I remember seeing this case when we were in Tulsa. We had a big church we were part of, and all kinds, sometimes some strange things would happen. And there was a dear sister got up, and she started prophesying right in the middle of the sermon, right at the altar call. And she was convinced it was God, and she's going on and on and on. And the pastor just looked at me and says, the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. Shut up and sit down. In love. Because what was happening is that was interfering with the most important moment in the service, was when the net was being put out, the invitation was being put out to receive someone to Christ. Did that mean that person had a demon in them? No, it could just be their flesh, as was going on back in then. So it needs to be in order. There needs to be decently. That doesn't mean they shouldn't flow, because it says, don't despise it, but it should be in order. It should be in order, because what he's talking about in this chapter is because when the tongues were being spoken out, people were speaking out messages in tongues, and there was no interpretation. Wait a minute, we're in church. In church, everything ought to be for edification, for building up, for instruction, for help, so that we all can profit by what's said. And if a bunch of people are just speaking out in tongues and there's no interpretation of it, then the purpose isn't being fulfilled. At home, go for it. Speak in tongues all you want. You're speaking mysteries to God. This is where there's a lot of confusion sometimes about tongues, because what he's talking about in chapter 14 is in a church setting, in a service setting. And the standard here, is this going to be of benefit to other people? Is this going to be of edification? And so part of the principle here is there has to be order. Now here's the other side of that. Order can become a restriction. Order can become a restriction. And I was asking the Lord years ago for a way to teach this principle. And he gave me this great example from my biology class. And maybe the only thing I ever remember from my biology class in 10th grade. That was not back in the primordial mist, by the way. That was... And I remember being taught that the basic classification of animals is vertebrate and invertebrate. I think that's right. At least that's a classification. Vertebrate, let me get this backwards. Well, in one of them, the skeleton is on the outside. Lobsters, crabs, shrimp. And what does that structure do? it provides protection for them, but it's what allows them to move. If you take the shell off the lobster, it's not protected and it really can't move. If you take the shell off of a crab, he's just flesh that flails around. But the higher type of animal is where the skeleton is on the inside, and that's hopefully what you and I belong to. And that's where the same purpose, the structure that allows you to move, is on the inside of you. And without that skeleton on the inside, you're what the scientists today believe you are, just a bunch of twitching wet meat. If you took your skeleton out of you, we're just going to puddle in the middle of your chair, and you may be able to think, but you can't do anything. You're just... What allows you to stand up, what allows you to walk, is those muscles, those tissues, those veins, those arteries are all hanging on something that's more solid, that's structure, which is your structure. And there's an order to that. The leg bone's connected to the thigh bone's connected. And part of that vision of the valleys was speaking of an Israel that had no order. There were dry bones scattered all over a desert, and that was a signal that Israel, in God's eyes, had no structure anymore. They were powerless, they were lifeless, and there was no order to them. And what's the first thing that happens when Ezekiel prophesies over those bones? This ankle bone comes from over here and finds the knee bone from over here that belongs to that same body. In other words, the very first thing the Spirit of God signifying he would do was to put them back in order. Because until they're in order, there's nothing to put the tissue on, the muscle on. There's nothing that can be done until things are, first of all, in order. Titus, I left you in Crete so that you may put things in order. I put things in order. 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 Now, the reason why the invertebrates, I think that's what we are more higher life than the vertebrates, is that what does a lobster have to do periodically? He has to get rid of that shell. Because that shell, if he doesn't get rid of it, is going to restrict him from growing. It's going to keep him from growing. And the same is true of order. Order is the purpose of order is to allow the body to function in a healthy manner, in a meaningful manner. But if that order starts becoming an outward shell that restricts growth and restricts movement, then it's not performing its purpose. So I'm sharing that with you because order is not legalism. Legalism restricts. Legalism says there's a whole bunch of things to do and don't do, and when you get up, you do them, you don't do, and then God's going to be pleased because you did them or you didn't do them. And what that does is that restricts the love of God. Because when a church is legalistic, the love of God is not flowing because it's limited. Because we're judging one another, we're judging people by what they did and what they didn't do instead of allowing God's love to flow through us. You following me? We're going to see as we go along. But I want to share that with you because you can take this order and misapply it. God's order doesn't restrict. God's order sets free. God's order sets free. Now, I'm going to set up the next time with this. Order does not only mean everything in its right place, but it also refers to priorities, putting first things first. In every area of our life, that's first things first in time, first things first in importance. There are priorities that God has set for us because His kingdom functions on these priorities. And when we begin to build our life and we don't build it on His priorities, then our life is out of order. Or you may have built your life on His priorities, but through the process of living, they get bumped out of order because our attention gets on things that are not vital and draws us away from things that are vital. And that's Satan's number one tool, is to get our priorities out of alignment. Because when our priorities are out of alignment, then we're out of alignment. And that's what we're going to begin to look at. Because when things are in order, then the life of God, the blessings of God, and the power of God flows in our life. When things are out of order, not only does it not flow, but we become exposed to the God of this earth. I'll close with this example. I started to share it before. Our children that had been with us from out of town have all gone back home. So yesterday we began to clean things up and pick things up. And there's a mat we have in our kitchen, in front of the kitchen sink. And this mat had just gotten dirty with people standing on it, and it was washable. So I said, all right, I'll wash it. So I went down and put it in the washing machine, and I put whatever you got to put in it, and I turned it on and went away, and the thing started going around. And I'm upstairs somewhere, and my wife said, whoa, wait a minute, something's wrong. You need to get downstairs, or, and I went downstairs, and the washing machine was about to walk across the room. Because all I put in there was one rug, and it was wet. And it went into the spin cycle, and because it was out of balance. So we're going to begin to look at, over the next few weeks, have a chance to look at our lives and see just maybe, the reason why things aren't working right is just maybe something's out of order. And the wonderful thing is, when you find out what's out of order, all you got to do is make that adjustment. It doesn't take long. It's an adjustment in your heart. And when it gets back in order, the peace will be there, and the life and the blessings of God will begin to flow.